I mean, he himself said, in fact, I am a hobbit. The simple pleasures of family life and watching things grow, his whole worldview is written into this kind of landscape of his work. And the desolation of them is very, very important in his narrative. See the contrast of what was beautiful and good and kind of holy, certainly enchanted, becoming dark and dangerous and full of evil.
You know, the central MacGuffin of the whole story, the ring, is it sin? Is it temptation? Is it what is it? Welcome to Into the Truth, the podcast from the Catholic Truth Society. Welcome to this special edition of the podcast in which we're going to talk about the new book by Fr Michael Halsall, and we're here in the Brompton Oratory in this beautiful room together with a live audience. So give us a round of applause to show us that you're here. Fantastic. Very energetic. Great. So, Father Michael, maybe we could start with you and your relationship to Tolkien. You said that you started reading him very early, and then came to start to see something deeper in his writing, kind of fairly late on. So, tell us a bit about what that first discussion about Tolkien over that glass of whiskey was really about.
Well, so that would be going back about 25 years now. Gosh, it's so long ago. 30 years, in fact, my word. Yes, Alex, a friend of mine who's a combat helicopter pilot in the Army Air Corps, had been away on a course, and he had to get his flying hours in before he could do combat flying. So they just flew for a couple of days and burned up lots of taxpayers' money. And he said, "Do you want to come for a ride?" So I thought it'd be rude not to. And we eventually flew around Neuschwanstein Castle in Bavaria twice, and then headed back home to North Germany so he could log his hours. But we got stuck in the snow halfway, and in this German officer's mess, and they dutifully put a bottle of whiskey in front of us. And we just sat talking. And he had studied English literature, and I'd mentioned I was reading, I think, Lord of the Rings again for the nth time. And we got talking about this particular aspect of the lengthening of the shadow. And this word shadow, which comes across in the text so much, and that's one reason why I chose this title for the book, A Light from the Shadows. It's a long time since I've written this book. Because it's an ever-present reality within his whole worldview. And I hadn't realized at the time that Tolkien had also been an army officer, and I began to research something of his life, and I hadn't realized also that he served with the Lancashire Fusiliers. So being a Lancastrian, that was an added extra of interest to me. His son had trained for the priesthood at Stonyhurst College in Lancashire, so Tolkien would have known Lancashire, and they've got the usual Tolkien trail. You can buy the map and, you know, the jam jar afterwards. So I think it kind of recognizes something in us as we were then soldiers serving of our lives, as we could not imagine what his life would have been. I mean, this is a man who went into service on the second day of the Battle of the Somme, where the Pals battalions from Lancashire were literally decimated by machine gun fire. And if you read John Garth's wonderful biography, Tolkien and The Great War, it really picks up the pieces and forensically puts together the actions that he was involved in the skirmishes. And it is by the grace of God and sheer good luck that he survived when most of his friends were killed.
Yes, he mentions, doesn't he, that by 1918, all but one of his friends were dead.
A battalion of 1,000 men were reduced to 15 able-bodied men and one officer by 1918. It was all going to be over by Christmas.
Yeah. So, having spent so long looking over his books, what would you say is what's your favourite? What's his best book?
The one I keep going back to, and it was published recently posthumously by his son, is the story of Beren and Luthien, which was one of the first of the two narratives that he wrote. And there are several versions of that story that actually exist. It was first published in 75, 2 years after his death, in the Silmarillion, but it exists in alliterative verse. It exists in earlier stories in some of the Lost Tales. And it is autobiographical for him and his wife, because they called each other Beren and Luthien. And if you go and visit their grave in North Oxford, you'll see on their gravestones Beren and Luthien, and he always called her my Luthien. But it's a story that's so rich in mythology. And interestingly, J.K. Rowling has stolen a couple of the episodes, like invisibility cloaks and stuff like that, from the story. It is dark at times, it's tragic at times, and it gave him that first idea of the intermarriage of elves and humans, where Luthien gives up her immortality out of her love for Beren to marry him, and we see that echoed later in The Lord of the Rings.
I mean, I have an older brother who's always a great Tolkien fan, and he refused to watch the films. I think it's 25 years since the films came out. He said he had a very specific idea in his mind of what everybody looked like, and he didn't want them to be ruined. I'm quite impressed that he's still managed not to see them since then. But you do mention a bit of this in the book, but of the kind of secondary works, the films, the cartoons, the recordings. What one do you think kind of expresses the author's intention best?
I think the BBC set of Lord of the Rings, which I managed to get a second-hand copy because it's not published anymore, online for my birthday last year, and I've listened to several times already. It is wonderful the way it's produced. Gollum in particular is absolutely outstanding in that narrative, but it doesn't introduce director-led characters as does Peter Jackson. And if after tonight you go home and think, I'm going to watch the films again because of tonight, then we failed. I sort of have a love-hate relation with them. Where they're good and faithful to the text, they're very good. And then there are other aspects to them. But it's a very difficult thing to direct, narrate, edit, abridge, because it's just so vast. But even just listening to it, the language is wonderful. It's English such as you don't get to listen to today in contemporary authors. His not just his words, but his use of syntax and words of expression still take the breath away sometimes.
So in Tolkien's own words, which you quoted a moment ago, The Lord of the Rings is a fundamentally religious and Catholic work, and yet his faith is often overlooked by media and readers. Why do you think that is? And I suppose to a certain extent, he hasn't suffered from the same kind of opprobrium maybe that Lewis has, with people kind of slightly, there's a great little sketch in which people say, it's a bit Christian, Lewis's stuff. So, first of all, why do you think that Tolkien took such a different route than Lewis did? And do you think that that's been to the benefit of his writing?
To answer the second question, yes, very much to the benefit. And I think that is why people keep going back to him, even though they don't recognize that woven into the fabric of his work is this unique philosophy and theology of his Catholic religion. And being a convert, of course, he had to learn it from scratch as a young boy from the age of 7 with the Oratorians. And it made a huge, deep impact upon him. And even more so because he and his brothers and sisters and mother were outcast from the family when they became Catholic. And he refers to his mother dying a martyr's death because of her worry just to keep body and soul together and keep the children lively in their faith. So it was very important from a young age that the faith was a major part of his life. He went to daily mass. He brought his children up in the faith. There's a lovely letter to his son when he was training, I think, for the South African Air Force in preparation for the Second World War, to tell him, learn the mass, learn the prayers, because you won't always be able to get to church. You won't always get to see a priest, make every opportunity. Tolkien hated allegory. He didn't like Lewis's works. I did read somewhere quite a long time ago that he used the F word in relation to some of his creatures. I could not name the source. And over a pint, probably in the Eagle and Child or two. But woven into the fabric of his writings are his faith, but also aspects of his readings of Anglo-Saxon texts and the way they saw the faith. Tolkien translated the Anglo-Saxon Exodus, which is like a sort of match of the day highlight of the book of Exodus, when they were translated from Latin into what we now call Old English for the evangelization of England. And he wrote a commentary on this. You can't get a copy of it for love nor money. If you do get the chance, buy it and hold on to it for 5 years, then flog it. But it's very, very rare. I've only seen one copy in the British Library. And for him, it was important to weave the story through the narrative, through the people. And we do see kind of scriptural images coming out, shining from time to time, which I think some Protestant commentators of Tolkien make too much of. So they're reading into it things that probably aren't there.
I mean, you mentioned the evangelium. You said that Tolkien proclaims the gospel, but without the trappings of religion. So how can we see the gospel in his work, and where do you think, having said what you just said, where do you see kind of Christ in particular?
Tolkien invented one word at least in English, which is eucatastrophe, the happy turn out of darkness, or a good but unexpected outcome. I think William Shakespeare invented 2,000 words in English. Tolkien just one. And we see that gospel outcome in his works at various stages. A good example of Gandalf, when he dies, I don't want to give the plot away here, but one of the most, I think, Platonic, Christian Platonic aspects of his narrative is where Gandalf explains to the three kindreds, Legolas, Aragorn, and Gimli the dwarf, what happened under the mountain of Moria. And he describes his body rather like medieval descriptions of the resurrected body of Jesus. It's uncertain, it's light, it's opaque, it's neither here nor there or both at once. That is the kind of happy turn when all is lost, where Aragorn calls out, beyond all hope. They thought they were going to have to continue the journey without him, and in some part they do. Another example, it's also rather reminiscent of Jesus's transfiguration on Mount Tabor. That's not to say that Gandalf is a Messiah figure. We have to be very careful, I think, of ascribing the offices of Jesus, prophet, priest, and king, to these three kindreds or specific characters. He's too good a writer for that, to fall into that kind of trap.
Although you do mention in the book that there's certainly messianic aspects to some of the things that Aragorn does.
Yes. But that's over 1,200 pages. They aren't a lot, but they kind of keep you engaged. And what does the kingship of Aragorn mean for the people? And there is one beautiful phrase actually where he, towards the end of the narrative, where Faramir is dying on his deathbed, and he sends a nurse out to get some dried athelas, the herb, which he actually anoints Frodo with at the beginning of the narrative, but it says he rubs it and anoints him and pauses in silence, almost like a sort of prayer, and mutters something to himself, rather like an exorcism. It's very liturgical. And for those who are Christians of a non-liturgical background probably wouldn't get that, but it's there nevertheless.
One question that I think is interesting, and I think feeds into the fact that the faith aspect has remained somewhat hidden, is that Tolkien was basically known in this rather odd genre of fantasy fiction, which is full of orcs and dwarves and elves and all kinds of weird and wonderful stuff, and lots of people who like getting dressed up and weird names and it seems. Do you think that that's a particularly good home for somebody who wants to write about serious things, or why do you think that was the particular genre that Tolkien ended up dedicating most of his writing to?
I think it does sit well. I mean, he himself said, in fact, I am a hobbit, in all but name. His characteristic, he was kind of writing himself into some of the characters. His love of England, his loathing of industrialization, his love of food and his pipe, they were ever-present things. The simple pleasures of family life and watching things grow, particularly trees. His whole worldview is written into this kind of landscape of his works, and they unfold slowly, and the desolation of them is very, very important in his narrative. I wrote a chapter on death and the afterlife, but one of the subheadings in that is the death of nature or the death of the environment, because that's really important for him, to see the contrast of what was beautiful and good and kind of holy, certainly enchanted, becoming dark and dangerous and full of evil, and almost lacking in any form of light and life, the darkest of shadows. For him is a great tragedy.
And so something which he saw the complete kind of opposite of in his wartime experience. You bring that very very vividly in the book, that the desolation that he saw in the middle of no man's land was something that almost he couldn't kind of shake off.
No. I mean, for that generation of Edwardian young men, there was no escaping the First War. It was with them for the rest of their lives. As the nation began to wake up, as we began to build cenotaphs and put rolls of honor in parish churches and schools, there were constant reminders of what was lost. I mean, he started writing his very first and earliest editions of what we now know as his Middle-earth writings when he was recovering from trench fever in 1917, moving in various places around Britain for rehabilitation. And at one stage he was almost court-martialed as a malingerer of refusing to go back to the front, but he remained instead as a training officer for replacements to go to the front. But it was, during those experiences when it was fresh in his mind and they were still hearing of the terrible, tolls of the deaths of the final stages of the war, that he was writing this stuff. So it was always going to, as I said, no one writes in a vacuum. But I wouldn't say it's allegorical of the First World War. It's just always going to be part of his psyche for the rest of his life.
One of the things that really struck me reading through this book, I mean, you say that you write it as an Englishman, and you write it as a 100% me as a Italian Pole living in London. I'm interested to see what you mean by that, because he talks about his writings as a mythology for England, something which he thought England was kind of missing in a sense.
Yeah.
So what was he trying to do? Because that's quite a big kind of project to undertake.
England's a strange place for those of you who don't know it very well.
Agreed.
He often went out in the countryside around Oxfordshire, and there's a little place called Wayland Smithy. It might just be over the border. but it's one of these Neolithic mounds with a gate in the front, a stone gate. And there's a story that Welland the Spirit, who was a smith who used to make armor and swords and such like, that if your horse lost a shoe and you've put a few groats on the wall and tied your horse up for the night and went away, it would come back repaired and made beautifully. He knew these stories from his studies in Old and Middle English. And these were on his doorstep, and some of the names which he took for his mythology from the English countryside. Because I mean, as a boy, I was brought up in the country on the edge of town and always out on the moors and the hills and the woods, just loving the fresh air and the exercise, and still find it tragic when I see huge building projects in green belts in parts of the nation, and can't help thinking, this is green belt, this is land we'll never get back. And for him, that was a great tragedy as he saw the industrialization of Birmingham and the city growing and growing and growing.
Yeah, I mean, he had studied, in particular, I think Beowulf was his kind of great love, wasn't it? And Beowulf is a fascinating text for a huge number of reasons, but one of them, and I think is particularly important to our subject this evening, is that it's a kind of pagan world which is already sort of Christianizing. Or a Christian world which has just come out of paganism. So, is that what he was kind of trying to do for England?
Tolkien knew Beowulf extremely well, inside out, back to front. He taught on it for over 30 years. There are 3 translations of Beowulf in existence, one of which has been published. Probably not the best one, actually. If you want to read Beowulf, read Seamus Heaney's version. It's the best translation, I think. Welland, in fact, this character from Wayland Smithy is mentioned in Beowulf, who makes the armour for the Danish knight, and speaks about his fate. And fate in Anglo-Saxon is Wyrd, W-Y-R-D. I don't speak Anglo-Saxon, by the way. I'm not going to break into it. But this idea that our lives are wrapped up in the fates, the lap of the gods. And Tolkien argues in his famous lecture, Beowulf, the Monsters and the Critics, which you can buy, he argues that Beowulf is England's first Christian poem that has been repaganized, that it demonstrates the contrast between the old fatalism of England with the emergent Christianization of the Anglo-Saxon evangelists and monks and priests who did remarkable work over a relatively short space of time in evangelizing and converting many of the North Germanic and Danish tribes. And you see within the life of Beowulf the tragedy working out, but moving from this idea of weird or fate into the ideas of providence, that God has an underlying plan, and that whilst he is free to act, God also is involved in the upholding not just of his life, but the whole of the universe. By the way, The Hobbit is only a reworking of Beowulf. All the main elements of The Hobbit are there in Beowulf. So it's just a kind of children's version of it, really.
There's an important place, I think, where we can move on to the worldview, those two kind of worldviews, the sort of pagan and the Christian worldview, and how those are kind of received and then communicated through the oeuvre of Tolkien. There's a very interesting chapter in your book where you look at evil, good and evil in a fallen world, and that in essence, Tolkien has a very Augustinian view that evil is a kind of lack. Evil is not something in itself, and there's many places where many examples that you pull out of that, especially in The Lord of the Rings. But then you said there is the odd character, a creature that seems to come from a more sort of dualist, Manichaean almost perspective, like Ungoliant. Tell us a little bit about that.
I'm going to be here till late. Okay. That's one reason why I chose to have the word shadow in the title, because of course a shadow is an absence of light, but is never absent from the thing which casts it. It's not like Peter Pan where you can lose your shadow. It is always intimately related to who you are. And so when Tolkien, I think it's Aragorn as Strider, uses the phrase of people falling into shadow in a mystical sense. And there's almost a kind of silence in the dialogue at that point when they don't quite grasp what this means, the young hobbits, because all they've known is the good life in the Shire. And then they encounter the wraiths, the undead, those who've fallen truly into shadow, and they begin to have this realization that the world is and can be a very, very dark place. I have argued in my other book, which is a publication of my PhD, that Tolkien is a Neoplatonist, but doesn't simply use an Augustinian view of Neoplatonism, but a much wider variety. He's too clever for that. He keeps you guessing. And just to, when you think you've got a handle on him, he throws in this dualistic idea that some characters just defy that kind of problematic categorization, that they just are what you might call pure evil. And then he steps back from the brink because the one who is the architect of it, Morgoth, who was like Sauron's boss back in the Silmarillion, back in the day, was an angel of light, was one of those who sang creation into order, from whom God made good of his discord and his rebellion. So we see this dualism at the very beginning as well.
So in that sense, Middle-earth is very much a fallen world in the same sense that ours is.
No.
No. Go on then.
There is no Garden of Eden. There is no Adam and Eve. There is no serpent as such. Creation is flawed from the very outset. But again, that's a very medieval view of the idea of the fall, capital F, in the scriptural texts, is that life is a struggle until the whole of nature is renewed. And people often ask Tolkien in his letters, with regard to Lord of the Rings, did you write the last bit of the Scouring of the Shire just at the end as a kind of a way of just upsetting everybody? But he says, no, it was part of the plan from the very outset. So you don't get this happily ever after. Only two people live happily ever after, and that's Eowyn and Faramir, really. The rest have to struggle and keep on realizing their true selves in this fallen world that Tolkien creates.
Yeah, so it's not that evil is done once and for all, is defeated once and for all, but you have to then go again and again to defeat it. Yeah. So in all of that, this central, MacGuffin of the whole story, the ring. Is it sin? Is it temptation? Is it what is it? Or is it all of those things or none?
It was not what Wagner thought it was. That's my good friend Alison Milbank, who supervised my PhD, has also written on Tolkien. She calls it a fetish. She uses that phrase. It is something which causes a fixation, that when it's got a hold on you, you just can't let it go. So look on the tube if you're going home on the train tonight. What is everyone doing on the train? Staring at their phones. They have become fetishes in one sense that people can't let go of, and parents are now being given advice by the government how not to let your children use them for more than 1 hour and 19 and a half minutes a day, because 20 minutes would be too much. The ring is something which is utterly corrupting because of its origin. because of the thing itself. And of course, the nearer it gets to its origin, where it was forged in the fires of Mount Doom, it gets heavier and heavier and more problematic. And the only person for whom it has no effect on is this strange character, Tom Bombadil, who in all versions of Tolkien, people stay away from. And there are doctoral theses written on who is Tom Bombadil, and it's way above my head. But it is a corrupting influence for everyone who has that opportunity to carry it for a prolonged period of time. They cease to own it, it begins to own them, and they fall into shadow. They come under the influence of its originator.
So one of the things that you speak about in the book is about the exploration of virtue in particular, and how Tolkien manages to make virtue kind of enjoyable and attractive, whereas those who fall into shadow do something which very much is not attractive. So tell us a little about what Tolkien was trying to do, what virtues he was really putting forward, and how.
I could actually put your hands up. The last time you ever heard a sermon on virtue in churches, probably a long time. Virtue is about being the right kind of person, not doing the right thing. It's not a form of hedonic or pleasurable decision-making, or that which works for the greatest good, or that which makes us happy, or that which brings about the right consequences. Virtue ethics or virtue theory is about becoming the right kind of person, and therefore its opposite, vice or vicious, is a polar opposite, and we see this in many of Tolkien's creatures. At what point the move from being virtuous to vicious is different for each person, and virtue theory, virtue ethics, is that kind of thing. It's quite subjective at one level. But I've brought out the virtues of courage and practical wisdom, but also of restraint or self-control, temperance. Why hasn't Gollum been executed? Many people had opportunity to get rid of this shameful, annoying, hideous creature who was entirely possessed by the ring, and it drove everything he was and did. But it was through virtue that he was not killed. It was
on numerous occasions.
On numerous occasions, because he still had some part to play. So I think one reason why some of the characters are so attractive, particularly Aragorn and Faramir, is that they live lives of great virtue, of chastity, of courage, of respect for other peoples, and restraint in their actions as well. And the four cardinal virtues, they're called cardinal because the word cardo in Latin means hinge, like the doors, the hinge. These are the four virtues that all the other virtues hang on: justice, temperance, practical wisdom, and courage, come out largely in Tolkien's works. And they're very attractive in a person. If we know somebody we like as a character, you can guarantee that they practice the virtues whether they know it or not.
Yeah, so which particular character has been your favourite? And has that changed over your life? Or
I'm very fond of Sam. He likes his fish and chips. Tolkien speaks about Sam as being like the ordinary infantryman he'd have served alongside, who he saw superior to himself. And John Gough mentions in his book, the men from the mill towns of Blackburn and Burnley and Colne and Nelson, Manchester, Oldham, the mill towns in which I was brought up, have a kind of affinity with these characters. Faithful, loyal, belligerent, sometimes very subservient, unnecessarily so. I mean, there's a lot of my mother in Sam. I was brought up, respect your elders. That means everybody, but especially doctors, teachers, and policemen. They were to be respected absolutely. If they said jump, you said how high. And Sam, I think, embodies all that is great about human nature, even though he wasn't a human. But Tolkien is writing in this character, I think the most virtuous character of them all.
Because it's interesting that England is always seen as a kind of class-obsessed nation, and it's true that there are Middle Earth is sort of stratified in some sense, and yet every different kind of type of being has their real parts to play, isn't it? It's not that the hobbits themselves being the sort of working class, should we say, or they're the ones that really carry the day in the end. So we see in that
it's a victory for the little people.
Yeah.
Really, I don't mean just physically little people, but those for whom the Ent Fangorn had not heard of. He couldn't place them in the great stories. They were way out west, living in the northwest of Middle Earth. They'd kind of been forgotten. And in fact, the riders had to find out where was this place called the Shire, So I quite like that as well. I don't like sitting on stages talking to people. Being in the wings, they were quite happy for that. And of course, they were the ones who ultimately placed the crown on Aragorn's head when he was crowned. They were, front of house from that point on, that people would sing of their great virtue, courage, and fortitude.
And they just happen to like all the things that English.
They just happen to like all the right kind of things, yeah.
So you also talk in the book about in a sense what all the creatures of Middle Earth kind of go towards, the grey havens. What is Tolkien saying about death and the afterlife? For the sort of different, for the elves, for the men in particular. You also talk about that there's a certain discourse about purgatory as well within Middle Earth. Tell us a little bit about that.
I think this is Tolkien at his most vague, which is not uncharacteristic, because if you look at life after death in sacred scripture, from the death of Abraham onwards,
Pretty vague.
It's very vague. It's different throughout the narrative. So there's no one real pattern. And that's why I think those who wrote the Catechism had a pretty hard job of trying to codify what do we believe in life after death. So Tolkien was on very moving ground in this respect. So I think it allowed his imagination to play well. There is no final resolution, really, apart from Aragorn, who dies and is incorrupt, which again is another fascinating aspect of the lives of the saints. When a person is, that their cause is initiated for sainthood and they move down the journey, one of the things that they do is exhume the body. Has it corrupted? And before St. John Henry Newman was beatified, they dug up his body and they found his cardinal's hat, and the body had decayed. And there were still parts of the coffin intact, and that's fine. But there are those situations in life, Bernadette of Lourdes, Padre Pio, and Catherine de Siena and others, you can still see their bodies incorrupt. And so he's not relating that to gospel values. It's there. And I think anybody with a kind of Catholic sensibility would recognize that. Again, purgatory, having to work out your salvation, having to become fully actualized and realized as a person, takes time. And all those involved in the quest were allowed to go to the Grey Havens for this kind of, you might say, some kind of, inner therapy. It's not clear what it is. It is that living out of life. And maybe there are aspects of his dealing with the First World War there as well, of having to kind of exercise those nightmares of life in the trenches. How do you go back to normal life after that experience? And I'm very happy for that to be vague, because there is no ultimate resolution in this. And one of the great chapters in Lord of the Rings is after it's finished. It's the appendix at the back of the story of Arwen and Aragorn, of her leaving her father and becoming mortal, and what that means in life and death. And he speaks of it as being the word bitter comes across, is written a lot. It's a hard thing to do. She's leaving behind not just her family, not just her culture, but her non-humanity, the very person she is, for love to become human. And there's great sacrifice involved in that for her, because she knows one day she'll have to release him. And that again is an important part of the realization of death, is that of bereavement and letting go.
One of the chapters that I read with great joy was your chapter on Galadriel and Mary, partly to exercise that incredibly annoying Galadriel from the Amazon series. But you devote some time to talking about the types of Our Lady and of why that would have been so important for Tolkien, particularly as an English Catholic, to include in his works. And tell us a little bit about that.
Okay, this started during lockdown, really, when I was going to write a book on Tolkien and Our Lady, and it kind of ground to a halt, but it's been sat there on a file somewhere on my laptop or a memory stick or something. And I thought, I can't finish without some acknowledgement of Our Lady, being a priest of Our Lady of Walsingham, the ordinariate of Our Lady of Walsingham. And Tolkien had a great devotion to Our Lady. During the Second World War, when he used to go on air raid duty, he says that he always took his rosary beads with him on patrol. And again, as a young man, I didn't have that sort of Catholic tribal appreciation of how important Our Lady is to English Catholics. I mean, you may not know that we are the only people that say the Hail Mary during the Mass. It's an English thing. We don't say it abroad. People go on Holland and say, oh, they forgot to say the Hail Mary. No, they didn't. It's a special privilege that we're allowed to say it at the end of the bidding prayers at Mass because of our relationship with Mary, England being her dowry. And I think that was a very English aspect of Tolkien's devotion. But we need to be extremely careful not to equate Galadriel with Our Lady. She's not the Immaculate One. She was prideful. She did lead the elves in rebellion and was therefore under the ban of the Valar, these kind of demigods. But we do hear of, her name being evoked in ways in which Catholic Christians evoke Our Lady in the Salve Regina, for example. There are strong linguistic links to that. But again, it's not there in full. If you knew the Salve Regina in English, you'd think, that sounds like. So again, he's being very clever, not to make it clear, but to kind of give a hint or a flavour. And there's a great degree of typology there. And I think we see this in Éowyn. If you're looking for a strong female character in Lord of the Rings, you've got to wait 1,000 pages nearly for it. But it's worth waiting for, because it's crucial to the plot and the resolution of the story. And, this kind of image of Éowyn and, I forget, is it Merry or Pippin, whichever one it is? Victoria, you'll know. Merry. Nerd alert. Merry stood by, Éowyn's father on the battlefield as he dies, like Mary and John at the cross. If you know the iconography, the image makes perfect sense, but it's not made obvious in an allegorical sense. And that, I think, the story is richer for it.
How can Tolkien really inspire creative Catholics and Christians today? Because I think he sets a wonderful example. What would you say the things that we could see as real inspirations for those of us? I mean, you mentioned in your talk at the beginning about how the Catholic kind of contribution to the cultural life, not only in this country but in the world has not been of at its highest point in the past 60, 70 years at least. Tolkien being a great exception to that. What is it that he can really inspire us to?
I taught in secondary school for 12 years when I first became a Catholic. And I used to say to my boys, my last 10 years was in a boys' school, I said, if you want to learn to write well, you have to read well. And if you want to read well, read Tolkien. Whether you like it or not, just read him. But it's more than that. I think that sense of recovering a sense of enchantment in the world, coming out of 2 decades, the 90s and noughties, of aggressive secularism through the Blair governments and, we don't do God and all that kind of thing. Channel 4, BBC being very anti-religious and anti-Catholic, certainly. We're seeing a very different temperature or temper amongst young people today, searching for transcendence, searching for the otherness of God, searching for meaning, truth, roots, and who they are. I think Tolkien provides all that. And one reason why I wrote this book the way I did was to be a kind of accompaniment to the story, which makes those allusions and metaphors and typologies more obvious than they are, to inspire people to read him and see through it a life of faith without all the trappings of religion that can come, because we are hardwired towards the good. As human beings, we are created in the image and likeness of God and therefore hardwired to be virtuous. We just sometimes need help along the way, pointing in the right direction and making it clear.
Well, one difficult question before we get right to the end is, Tolkien is sometimes accused of a certain amount of kind of racism through his depiction of the various races of Middle Earth, etc. What do you think of those kinds of accusations against?
There's a footnote in my other book, which I've gathered together. He's been accused of about 14 things: racism, sexism, homophobia, all kinds of, even being anti-nylon, not modern fabrics, I say it's nonsense, really, just like he's not sexist. He was a man of his time. I said at the beginning, he wrote for very different people than us. He wasn't writing for postmodern or post-postmodern people like ourselves. He was writing in a very different way than we write today. And simple responses. So the orcs of Isengard, what do they have on their flag? The white hand. How's he racist? There are elements of, the orcs exist partly because of the evil of Morgoth and Sauron, because they are elves, they are good, they are substantially good things that have been corrupted, as we are all corrupted to some degree, they by coercion. I never got the sort of Peter Jackson thing where you've got orcs being born out of jelly and appearing out of some kind of primeval ooze. But Tolkien himself, if you read his letters and some of his published works after his death, he does contradict himself in the origin of the orcs. So it's not as straightforward as it possibly sounds. No, I wouldn't call him racist. You might call him a little bit superior. After all, he is inaugurating the Age of Men as a resolution to the Lord of the Rings, but not to the exclusion of all else. And as a medievalist, he'd have been very aware of the great chain of being, which is evident within medieval thinking, with God at the top and stones at the bottom. Part of the medieval feudal system was that it is a hierarchical ladder. And there's a wonderful article written by Rowan Williams, a former Archbishop of Canterbury, on this, which acknowledges, yes, there was this hierarchy and place, but in point of fact, each element of the ladder is interdependent. So therefore one can't exist without the other, in which case we should not be arrogant and, I think Aragorn becomes this person who draws people together rather than divides them. So that's my take on it.
Brilliant. Well, thanks very much for that. For sorting that one out once and for all.
For tonight, anyway.
Brilliant. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Michael.